So from the very beginning of this Advent season, through Christmas, we ask the question that echoed through the centuries of faith and longing, actually. And the question is, what child is this? It's a question that rises easily to our lips, especially in the candlelight, that's carried by familiar melodies and beloved words. And at first, the answer seems gentle, even I'd say comforting. A child was born quietly. A child was laid in a manger. A child welcomed by shepherds and angels. But as the season unfolds, this question, it becomes deeper, and the answers become more complex. So today we just heard the story of the Magi from this Gospel of Matthew, and we discovered that this child does not simply enter the world peacefully. No, he enters it truthfully. See, Matthew tells us that the Magi come from the east because they've seen something in the heavens, and they observe this light that didn't simply appear and then just fade, but one that would not let them remain where they were. See, the Magi were scholars, we're told, and observers of the stars, and people who believed that the movements of the cosmos really mattered. They paid attention. They watched carefully. And whatever they saw convinced them that something world-altering had occurred. You see, they could have not just noted the sign and discussed it amongst themselves. Wow, that was really cool. And then just gone back to their routines. But instead, they packed for a journey. Because true revelation rarely leaves us unchanged. The light they saw didn't remain contained, but it drew them outward. It disrupted settled assumptions. And it compelled movement that was costly, uncertain, movement that was risky. Because it's important to note that the Magi were truly outsiders. They were not part of Israel's religious tradition, and they didn't know how the prophecies by heart. And yet, they sensed that this light spoke not only to the one nation, but to the ordering of the world itself. So they too were longing for a new world order, and one not governed by fear or domination, but actually shaped by peace and compassion. So they took the journey. And when they arrive in Jerusalem, they do what seems logical. They go to the palace. And after all, kings are found in palaces, especially kings of power. But the moment they ask their question, where is the child who has been born king of the Jews? The air starts to shift. You see, Herod was a ruler sustained by violence and suspicion, and his power depended on eliminating threats, whether they were real or just imagined. And the idea of another king, even this infant, was enough to unsettle him. So Matthew tells us that not only Herod, but all of Jerusalem was troubled. Because with fear it grips those who rule by force, and it never remains isolated. Think about it. Fear spreads. Anxiety, it multiplies. And innocent people are always the ones who pay the price. And Herod responds with calculated politeness. He pretends he's interested. He asks the religious leaders to search the scriptures, and he gathers information under the appearance of true devotion. And then he sends the Magi on their way, hoping to use their curiosity to secure his own power. This is where the story begins to darken. And this is where we often wish it wouldn't. We prefer the Magi to kneel, to the gifts be given, and the story to conclude right there, quiet, peaceful. Everybody's happy. But Matthew does not offer us that comfort, because the birth of this child doesn't simply inspire worship, it exposes the cost of unjust power. The Magi eventually find the child, but not in a palace, but instead in a home. So that's where they kneel. That's where they open their treasures of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and gifts that speak of kingship, holiness, and suffering all at once. So even here, the story refuses to remain sentimental. Because then the Magi are warned in a dream not to return to Herod. And they listen. They choose another road to go back. And it's a small line in the story, but actually this carries significant weight. Faith, it seems, sometimes look like changing direction when the road you're no longer leads you toward peace. The Magi leave by another way. But the danger does not leave with them. No, Joseph is then warned in a dream. And in the middle of the night, Mary and Joseph gather what they can and they flee. They don't even pause to debate. It's not even up for discussion. They don't wait for daylight, they run. They flee the threat of extinction at the hands of an insecure tyrant. They become refugees. And this isn't just an incidental detail of the story of Jesus. It's all part of his formation. You see, the Holy Family crosses borders not by choice, but by necessity. And they live as strangers in a foreign land, dependent on the mercy of others. This is not a rare moment in history. It's a story repeated across generations, across nations. And even when they eventually return home, the child of Mary and Joseph does not return untouched. Jesus grows up hearing the story. How do you tell a child this? He grows up hearing the story, and he learns that his life was dangerous before he could even speak. And he learns that fear-driven power took the lives of other children in an attempt to eliminate him. So I ask again, what child is this? This is a child whose very existence provoked violence. This is a child whose early years were shaped by displacement and loss. This is a child whose body carries the knowledge of trauma. God's body knows trauma. And because God's body knows trauma, God's ministry emerges not from abstraction, but from embodied compassion. You see, Jesus does not proclaim God's nearness from a distance. Jesus proclaims it as one who has lived with the knowledge and fear of flight, loss, and survival. And this echoes of those early years shape how the world and how he moves with it. So when Jesus later encounters those who are marginalized and displaced or crushed by the systems of power, he doesn't treat them as interruptions. He really sees them. He stays with them. He touches those who others avoid. And he listens to stories others rush past. Ugh, not this again. This is not accidental kindness. It's a life formed by knowing what it means to be vulnerable. Oppression leaves its mark. But you know what? So does mercy. It's no small thing that Jesus grows into a ministry centered not on securing power, but on restoring relationships. He doesn't gather an army, he gathers people. And he doesn't build walls, he builds tables. And he doesn't ask, how do I protect myself? But rather, how do I remain faithful to love? That orientation towards presence, toward compassion, toward being with can be traced all the way back to the beginning of his life. And it's just worth lingering here. Because if I said throughout the series, formation matters. And so often we just want to jump quickly from Jesus' birth to his teachings, from the manger to the message. But you see, Matthew will not allow us to rush. He insists that we know who Jesus becomes inseparable of what Jesus has lived. And Jesus grows into his ministry not insulated from suffering, but acquainted with it. And Jesus learns early that power rooted in fear destroys rather than protects. And he learns that violence justified in the name of security always spills over, especially on the innocent. And he learns through the steadfast presence of Mary and Joseph that faithfulness is often quiet, persistent, but also it's very, very costly. So this helps us understand why Jesus later resists the temptations of power offered to him. He refuses to rule by force, and he declines to perform signs meant to impress rather than heal. And he consistently turns away from domination and toward relationship. See, these were not merely moral choices. They're deeply personal ones. Jesus knows what it means to live in a world that's where fear shapes decisions. And because he knows this world from the inside, he speaks into it with authority. Not with authority of intimidation, but actually with authority with compassion. And that authority is what draws people to him. Not because he promises safety by any means, but because he offers presence. And not because he guarantees certainty, but because he embodies faithfulness. And this, too, is part of the echo of light the Magi first perceived. They were not simply responding to a celestial event. No, they were responding to the possibility that the world could be ordered differently. The leadership, it could look differently. And that peace could be more than just the absence of conflict. It could be the presence of justice and of care. The Magi risked misunderstanding. They risked travel. They risked being changed. And in doing so, they remind us that faith is rarely comfortable. Think about that. But it's always transformative. Their story presses gently but really firmly upon us. Because we too live in a world shaped by fear, shaped by uncertainty. And we too are tempted to seek safety with withdrawal, certainty and control and comfort and understanding. And yet, the light of Christ continues to invite us outward, toward connection, toward compassion, actually towards one another. And to follow this child is not simply to admire him, but it's to allow our lives to be reordered around his way of being in the world, which really means paying attention to those we encounter, being attentive to those who are vulnerable, which means resisting fear-driven narratives, which means choosing presence when absence could be so much easier. This is not work that we do perfectly, but it is work that we do faithfully. And the gospel promises that as we do this, we do not walk alone. We're never alone through this. And that just brings us back to the Magi themselves. See, the Magi, too, stand as witnesses to this way of being. They didn't arrive with certainty, and instead they arrived with questions. They didn't come with demanding answers. They came offering reverence. And when they recognized that returning to Herod would mean participating in harm, they chose another way. Their decision matters because it reminds us that faith is not only about what we believe, but what about we refuse to participate. See, sometimes faith requires distance from fear-based power, and sometimes it calls us to walk away from systems that rely on domination rather than justice. So this Magi's journey did not end in triumph. It ends quietly. It ends with obedience and discernment. And they return home changed, carrying this knowledge that true authority looks nothing like Herod's throne, And that knowledge, once received, cannot be undone. That's why this story continues to resonate throughout centuries. Because we still live in a world shaped by insecure power. We still see fear disguised as strength, and we still witness the devastating consequences when leaders choose self-preservation over human dignity, and we still see people, ordinary people, caught in the wake of those decisions. Families who are forced to leave familiar places search for safety. And this isn't just ancient history, it's present reality, which is why the proclamation of this child matters so deeply. Jesus doesn't promise an escape from hardship, but Jesus promises presence from within it. And he doesn't deny the reality of suffering, he enters into it. And from within it, he insists that God remains with us, not only individually, but together. And this is where the call of the gospel becomes very clear. If God chooses presence over power, maybe we should probably do the same. And if God chooses compassion over control, then, I would think that might be a must for us. And if God chooses to be with humanity in its most fragile moments, well, then I think we're called to be with one another, especially when it's an uncomfortable or even sometimes even costly towards us. This isn't sentimental togetherness, but it is holy solidarity. And to be with one another means resisting the urge to withdraw when the world feels overwhelming. It means refusing to let fear have that final word. It means choosing relationships when isolation seems more straightforward. It means paying attention to where the light seems to reverberate, and sometimes faintly, sometimes unexpectedly, and allowing it to guide our steps. The Magi teach us. They teach us such attentiveness requires humility. And Jesus teaches us that such presence, well, it requires courage. And the good news is that we are not asked to do this alone. And that same light that drew the Magi, that same light shines. And that same God who was with Mary and Joseph in the flight is also with us. And that same Christ who knew oppression and proclaimed peace continues to shape our calling. So as a series of what child is this comes to a close, the answer before us is both sobering and actually very hopeful. This is a child who draws outsiders in. This is a child whose life exposes the cost of unjust power. This is a child who knows trauma and still proclaims justice. This is a child who insists that God remains with us and that we are called to stay with one another, especially in the hard times. So as we step into this new year, the invitation is not to have all the answers, but to live into that question faithfully, to become practitioners of peace in a world still shaped by fear, and to listen to the reverberation of light and to actually follow it. Because the more we see one another, the more we hear one another, the more we walk together, the less alone we feel. So what child is this? This, my friends, this is a child who still unsettles unjust power, still draws seekers from afar, still knows our pain, still leads us toward peace, and still, by grace, invites each of us to follow the light. Amen. Amen.